I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area on a lovely fall afternoon visiting with Ctein, a scientist, fine art photographer, and author who Kodak at one point called one of the finest color printers in the world. And Ctein, thank you for the opportunity of visiting with you. It's a real pleasure, and to finally see the darkroom that you've told me about. Now I get to see it in the flesh. Well, between your darkroom and your clothing, and I see you've now changed into blood. This is a Men in Black location.
Yes.
But the black clothing makes sense, I think, just in terms of not reflecting onto the materials. Is that right?
In fact, that is one of the main reasons I wear it. It also very nicely doesn't show the stain of the darkroom chemicals as badly, but it's work clothes anyway.
Right.
But the real reason is when I'm standing over the enlarger and working, I don't want the scattered light to bounce off a bright shirt.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
So that's the reason for the clothes change, and also so that I'm not wearing the good clothes here in the darkroom.
Okay, Dr. Science, how do we make dye transfer prints?
Well, overall, dye transfer is an assembly process. It's very different from a normal darkroom process. It's much more like your inkjet process. We're actually building up a print from separate colors. And what I do here is I make a set of printing plates in the darkroom called matrices. And the first thing I'm going to do is show how those are made. I make up a printing plate for each of the primary colors, magenta, yellow, and cyan.
These are the subtractive primaries.
Subtractive primaries. And I actually use those to take dye and transfer it to a sheet of white paper, which is where the name comes from. And I do this in succession for each of the primary colors. And I'll be demonstrating that also. So it is literally an assembly process. I build up the image out of 3 separate colors.
So you do 3 black and white pieces of film, which are called matrices, and then these matrices
Are the plates
plates
that I use for printing. The thing about dye transfer, which most people don't know, is that it's a negative to positive process. It is a negative printing process. It was used so much for advertising and commercial photography that everyone thinks it's for printing slides. It's not. To print from slides, you actually had to go through an intermediate separation step to get negatives. And the reason people did that was for the reasons we discussed before, which is it's so hard to get good prints from slides. So dye transfer just blew away everything else. But it is fundamentally a negative process. I was one of the few photographers in the world who actually used it as a negative process. I may be the only one today who is still doing so because the materials are difficult, if not impossible, to come by. So, although we concentrated on talking about ilfochrome outside, almost all my photography, my fine art photography, is color negative photography. Mm-hmm. So dye transfer meshes with it perfectly. It's the ultimate color negative printing process for my color negatives.
Okay, where do we start?
Well, I've got here a negative that in fact I'm going to print, 6 by 7 centimeter negative for my Scotland series. And setting it up in the enlarger is pretty much conventional. There is in fact nothing special about this enlarger. It's an ordinary color head enlarger. You can print dye transfer with any enlarger. I've also got an 8 by 10 cold light here that I use when I have to work from 8 by 10. Now, at this point, what I would be doing, except we're going to do it with the lights on because you wouldn't see anything otherwise, is I'd be turning on the enlarger, I would be focusing it, I'd be adjusting it. This here is a vacuum easel. There's a series of stainless steel pins here at the end. This is a sheet of pan matrix film. This is the stuff that gets turned into a dye transfer matrix. Obviously this one won't, it's a light sensitive film. This is our sacrifice sheet. And it has registration holes punched in the end. They fit on the pins on the registration easel. And they just press right into place.
Right.
And the wonderful thing about this very primitive system is that it can hold registration to better than 1/10 of a millimeter over a large area like this. It's an amazingly precise system.
So what you have is a vacuum source there are holes in the base of the easel, and they're creating a vacuum which is sucking the film down flat onto the base of the easel.
And that's simply because during the exposures, you don't want it to buckle. You can see it lies pretty flat anyway,
Right.
but you don't want it to move during the exposures. And in particular, since I have to do this for 3 sheets of film, I want them to be in exactly the same position for all 3, or there'll be registration errors in the final print. So that's the reason for the vacuum easel. The way I print, I like to have large, clean white borders on my prints where I can sign the prints so they look good on display. So what I also have is a mask that I lay over the top of the matrix film to make a white border around it. And that also presses on the registration pins, like so, and just lays down on top of it. And I do that for each of these. But that way it masks off some of the light, and I get this nice white border on the edges. Then what I'll be doing is exposing the film. And for that, I've got colored filters. Yeah. It's a color negative process, which means you use complementary colors. You use the red filter to isolate the part of the image that you want to print with the cyan dye. It's complementary color.
Blue with yellow.
The blue with yellow, the green with magenta.
Right.
And they go under the lens of the enlarger here in the light path.
Now, although this is a dichroic head enlarger, you're not using any of the filters in the enlarging head.
Actually, I do use the filters in the enlarging head. And the reason for that is that some of my exposures can get rather long, especially if I'm doing complex masking to get the kind of effect I want, to control contrast, to do dodging and burning in. The matrix film is supposed to be limited to a 90-second exposure before reciprocity effects set in. I have made prints with matrix exposures as long as 20 minutes. And the reason is, as long as all the exposure times are the same, any characteristics of the film change the same for all 3 matrices. So I don't get crossover problems or other sensitivity problems. What I use is the filters in the dichroic head to equalize the exposures. If the red exposure is too short relative to the others, for example, I can dial in some cyan filtration.
Right.
And this allows me to control that. And it's just an easier way for me to work. It also means when I'm evaluating test prints, I may look at a test print and say, this is 5cc2 magenta. And I'm used to doing that from working in the darkroom with viewing filters and all of that. We both are. In that case, I can easily say, well, I need to make a 5cc adjustment up here instead of calculating.
Instead of changing the time.
Precisely. Instead of changing the time, I change the filtration and keep my times equal. And that way, all the matrices get exactly the same exposure and exactly the same development. And that means their contrast and tonal characteristics are identical. So we get no color crossover, we get good grayscale, all of that.
Okay, so now we're going to go into the dark and we're going to expose the 3 pieces of film.
Right. And what's going to then happen after we do that is I'm going to be developing the sheet of film, and that also takes place in the dark, so there will be nothing interesting to see until we get it into the fixer when I turn back on the room lights. The developing process just looks like ordinary film development. It's after it gets into the fixer that it gets interesting and we turn it into a printing plate. All right, I've got the enlarger set up now and focused. So I'm going into my box of matrix film and pulling out the first sheet of film. Typically, I'll end up doing 2 sets of test strips before I'll make a set of final matrices. That's based on a lot of experience, on the fact that I usually have proof sheets for the negatives anyway, so I have some idea of what they look like and what their exposures are. It's not much different than I would for making a conventional color print.
Right. All right.
But each of those tests is time consuming because it involves making a set of matrices, small strip matrices, then I have to process them, then I have to dye them, then I have to transfer them.
Right.
So unlike running a test strip with a conventional photographic process, a test strip here takes about an hour and a half. So making a final set of matrices from start is usually an all-day process.
Well, now we know why not that many people do this anymore.
And why they charge so much money when they did.
Right.
It's very labor intensive.
Right.
It's incredibly labor intensive. As you can see from my darkroom, it doesn't require very fancy equipment. and that was one of the things that got me into doing the process, was someone pointing out to me that this was invented back in the 1920s and the 30s, and they didn't have fancy densitometers and expensive lab equipment then. By today's standards, it was all Stone Age. You didn't need fancy equipment to do dye transfer. What you needed was a lot of skill and a lot of time. What I'm doing now is I've put the matrix film on the vacuum easel. I'm laying the mask on top, and I'm ready to start the exposure. So I turn off the enlarger, pull the dark slide, and we're starting the exposure. This is a modest one. This is 50 seconds at f8.
So you do 50 seconds on one piece of film, 50 seconds on the second, 50 seconds on the third.
And then I would take them all over to the developer.
Right. Now, is it necessary to know which piece of film was through which filter?
Oh, yes, it is. You can do wonderful things mixing and matching them. It's sort of like crossing channels in Photoshop.
How do you identify them?
You clip the corners of them.
Aha.
Old Kodak trip. Cut a little corner off of the film.
Right.
You leave all the corners intact for the cyan printer. You cut one corner for the magenta printer. You cut two corners for the yellow printer.
So this is just like...
It's a tradition.
So this is just like traditional papers that have a clipped corner to let you know that the emulsion is facing you if the clipped corner is in the upper right.
Exactly, exactly. Okay, I finished exposing the matrix. I've got the developer in the tray. Now the film is going into the developer as soon as I start my timer. And what you're going to listen to now is the pleasant, soothing sounds of developer being sloshed back and forth.
So you're developing this the way people always have developed sheet film in a tray. You agitate back and forth, make sure that the chemical's covering the film properly.
Except much, much more carefully. Matrix film has a very thick emulsion, and it takes a long time for the developer to penetrate. So I use a water pre-soak to help even it out. And the agitation is actually very critical, because in a normal single sheet of film, if there's a little bit of uneven development, it'll make a slight density variation across the print, but you'll probably hardly even notice it, if at all. In this, if I get uneven development at all, it will differ between the three matrices. And that means I'll have different relative densities at different spots in the picture, and you'll see color splotches.
How long is the development time?
The normal development time is 2 minutes. I've come up with a developer modification that lets me run it from 3 to 5 minutes. And that produces much, much more even development. Again, this is some chemical modifications I've worked out. But this stage is absolutely critical, because if you don't get completely uniform development, you've essentially ruined it. You have to go back and make a new set of matrices. And not only have you wasted all that time, but matrix film is very expensive. And currently, pan matrix film is not available anywhere else in the world. So every wasted set of matrices is one less print I'll be able to make in the future, ever.
And what about temperature control?
Temperature control is, it's a process that works at room temperature, 68 degrees. So I mix my developer ahead of time, and I simply make sure the room temperature is correct. And it's a pretty large volume of developer. It's about half a gallon. So it doesn't drift much. Okay, the matrix is going into the rinse tray now, which is just a water rinse. So generally I can hold temperature to within plus or minus a quarter of a degree. And Kodak tolerance says plus or minus half a degree at 68. So I'm well under control for that. Also, if one's developing all three matrices at the same time, which I can do with good uniformity for longer development times, they're all affected equally by a change in temperature.
And so you'll interleave them as you work with them in the tray?
Yes. Okay, now it's in the fixer tray, and in a minute we'll be able to turn on the room lights. And this is just a non-hardening color film fixer. The developer is a special developer. It's not your ordinary paper developer. It's what's called a tanning developer. It's a pyro formulation for those of your viewers who know old film developing processes. Pyro developers were used with films because they produced a nice stain in the developing process that printed very well on black and white papers. They also harden the emulsion. And that's the trick to making this work. Okay, the room lights are about to come on. Now if you come over here with the camera, you can see that there's nothing very interesting to see. It looks like we have a largely black sheet of film. But there really is a developed image in this film. You just can't see it because the film itself is a dark blue-black. But remember I said this was a special tanning developer that acted like a hardening developer. Embedded in the gelatin of this emulsion is an image, which is both an image in silver and an image pattern in hardened gelatin. And that's what we're going to extract now. Okay, and I'm going to empty the fixer out of the tray. Okay, here's now where we actually bring out the matrix. As I said, there's a nice emulsion here which has an image embedded in it, which you can maybe or maybe not see on camera, just barely. This is the part that's unexposed, this is the part that's exposed. This will become much more obvious in a second.
That's hot water, obviously.
That's hot water. And see what's happened? It's melting the part of the gelatin that wasn't exposed.
Right.
And now what we do is we gently agitate back and forth. This is a negative to positive process. The unexposed areas are the areas that we want to be white, such as the border. Those are the areas that were unexposed. They didn't receive any development in the tanning developer, which means they didn't get hardened. So they wash away in the hot water. And that's what's special about the matrix film. First of all, it's made of this unhardened gelatin, so that it will melt if you put it in hot water. If you do this with normal film, it wouldn't melt. It might reticulate a little, but it wouldn't melt. The second thing is you noticed how blue-black it was. That's because the film is loaded with pigment to absorb light. And it's the interaction between that pigment and the exposure which actually generates the relief image. So matrix film needs to be a special film that has a heavy load of colored pigment in it, and it's unhardened as well. And it needs to be a thick emulsion so that it makes a good printing plate. All of these things make it difficult to manufacture. And it's why you just can't go to a normal manufacturer and say, oh, do me a run of it. And they say, oh, no problem, we know how to do this. They can do it with some experimentation and some formulation, but it does take work. There is an art to making good matrix film. I'm not saying it's state-of-the-art problem. It's certainly not. They were making this stuff almost a century ago. But it does require some effort. Now at this point, I'm starting to see.
And this is a process that goes to completion.
Yes.
So, which means you do it until it's all done. You can't overdo it.
You can't overdo it. You do it until the water is clear. Absolutely. There's a little bit of gelatin that always sticks to the cut edge of the film, so you just skim that off with your fingers so that it doesn't get loose in the dye bath or stick somewhere where you don't want it to. You have to be fairly meticulous about removing all of the excess gelatin, because if you don't, it'll print. Any place where you have gelatin where you don't want it is going to make a dark spot in the print. This is also a place where obviously one doesn't want to be too careless, because if you slip or do something wrong or scratch your finger across it, well, it's big, wet, soft gelatin, and you've just ruined the matrix. And you're back to square one again, which is make another set of matrices. Now, that's actually looking pretty clean at this point, and if I hold it up a bit like this against the light of the tray, you can see it looks like a big black and white transparency. This gets hung up to dry, and with the other two matrices, when they're dry, we have to let them dry first because that helps firm up the gelatin. If we tried to print with them now, they would be so fragile that there'd be a very serious risk of scratching them.
That's intense.
So we've got a set of finished matrices now, and they're almost done drying. It takes a couple of hours for them to dry, but in the meantime, what I'm going to do is get the paper set up. This is dye transfer paper. It's what we would call an F-surface paper, except no silver salts and a mordant chemical that will pick up the dye molecules. Now, the first thing I need to do is to put this and pre-soak it in some water just to clean off any gelatin.
Right.
Anyway, this has just been soaked in water at this point. What it's going into now is something called paper conditioner. This is a wetting agent that has a neutral pH that just makes it easier for the paper to pick up the dye. Now what I'm going to do is get the matrices set up to go into the dye baths. Our cyan, our magenta, and our yellow. Now what I need is a tray of hot water, because after we went to all the trouble of drying out the matrices, now we're going to wet them again. This is a pre-soak to swell the emulsion. By soaking them in hot water, we rapidly expand the gelatin again, so it'll be ready as a printing plate. With hot water, it doesn't take more than a minute. And now I've put the magenta in the hot water, and I'm going to go put the cyan in the dye bath. And this is a rocker table. It has a little motor attached to it that tilts it back and forth. And it just relieves you of the drudgery and the attention of having to go and manually rock the trays. And there's the magenta printer, and it's going to go into the magenta dye. As you commented earlier, these are very intense, rich dyes. They're brilliant. That's the reason why we can get such rich tonality in the dye transfer print, and why we get such deep blacks. You had asked about why there is no black printer, why it's a CMY process, not a CMYK process. And the reason is that in conventional color printing, on a 4-color press or an inkjet printer, you need a black because the 3 primary colors aren't saturated enough nor transparent enough that when you mix them together, you'll get a pure black. Theoretically, if you mix cyan, magenta, and yellow together, it will make black. Subtractive colors, and it will subtract all the light. With real inks, it doesn't do it. You end up with a brownish black or a muddy brown or something like this because it's hard to get it to absorb all the light. In dye transfer, the dyes are extremely intense and they're completely transparent, so they don't scatter light back. And if you lay all 3 of the dyes onto a sheet of paper, you get a pure black. So there's no need for a special black printer. And that's the yellow. They need to soak for about 10 minutes. At that point, they will have absorbed as much dye as they can.
So this again is a completion process.
This is a completion process. Yeah, this is the trick that makes dye transfer work. These are what are called acid fixing dyes. And the way they work is that at a certain acidity, at a certain pH, they can absorb into the gelatin to a certain degree and no more. Since it's a constant amount of dye per unit of gelatin, the thicker the gelatin, the more dye it carries.
You make the exposure, the gelatin on the pan matrix film varies in thickness based on the amount of light that it's absorbing.
That's correct.
Then when you put the matrix into the dye, it absorbs that specific dye in proportion to its thickness.
That is also correct.
Okay, so now the next step is going to be to then transfer each of these onto the piece of printing paper, and again, that proportionality will carry over.
Exactly, because all the dye will go from the matrix into the paper. And this is also why it's a negative to positive process. The more light, the more exposure the film gets. The more exposure the film gets, the more gelatin it has. The more gelatin it has, the more dye it picks up, and the darker the print is. So more light exposure means a darker print. Okay, the matrices have been soaking in the dye long enough. They're fully imbibed. At this point, what I need to do is make up rinse baths for them. If I simply took the matrix out of the dye bath and squeeged it onto the paper, there'd be a whole bunch of drippy dye that would go along with it. You know, we wouldn't get nice clean whites, we just get dye splotches all over. So what I use is an acetic acid rinse, 1% acetic acid, essentially stop bath, to rinse off the excess dye. That is, the dye that's just sticking to the film and hasn't actually been absorbed by the gelatin. Now here's where most of the control comes in. Up to this point, I've had a lot of control over the process. Obviously, I can control the exposure of each of the matrices individually to affect overall color balance, and I can do dodging and burning in. In a pinch, I can even develop them separately. And I can certainly alter their contrast during development by varying the development time. So much as with a regular black and white material, I can control the exposure and the color balance, and I can control the overall contrast. And in that sense, it's only a little more versatile than a normal color printing process would be. I have the equivalent of different grades of paper, but that's about it. The real place where the control comes in is during the rinse stage, because by adding different amounts of chemicals to the acid rinse, I can affect how much dye is actually carried over for the print. Now, in this case, having made some test prints already, I know that their cyan matrix here is a little bit too dark. Darker is better than lighter. If there's a little bit excess gelatin, I can remove some dye. If there's no gelatin in a highlight, it's hard to add dye. So what I'm going to be using here is a compound called sodium acetate, and what I'm going to add is, in this case, about 2% of the solution to my rinse bath. And that's going to take out a little bit of cyan dye from the matrix overall. In other words, if that's the only thing I did, the print would come out a bit lighter and a bit redder. It would be minus cyan. Incidentally, there are also additives I can use that will make it pick up more dye. For instance, if I put additional acid into the rinse, the matrix will actually retain more of the dye when I apply the rinse. So I can make it darker that way. What you learn over the years is how to do this. The thing is, you can also do this in combination. For instance, if I were to add additional acid here, make this stronger, and put some of the dye in the rinse as well, the matrix would actually pick up a bit more dye in the rinse instead of losing it. So it would be darker and more contrasty.
Right.
And I can do all these things in combination. There's also a compound called highlight reducer. If I add this to the rinse, it takes dye only out of the highlights. Doesn't affect anything else. So if you have a highlight that's dingy, you can whiten it up this way. Or if you have a highlight that has a color cast for some reason, where the rest of the print doesn't, maybe because of mixed lighting or something like that, I can correct it this way. What it really is it's sort of a poor man's version of curves in Photoshop.
Okay.
I can change the curve shape for each of the dyes individually. Not just the total amount of dye, but I can change the slope, I can change where the highlight is, I can change where the shadow is, and I can do it for all three colors independently, depending on how I modify the rinses and additions I could make to the dye baths themselves. I can make high, low, and normal contrast dye baths for just overall changes. I've even corrected color crossover this way. I've done aerial photographs, which normally have a problem because of the scattering of light in the sky. What you end up with is very poor contrast in the blue image. The yellow printer is very low. And you see this in aerial photographs. The highlights look fine and the shadows all look bluish. In dye transfer, I've been able to undo this.
Right.
So the first thing we're going to do now is rinse off the cyan matrix for transfer. And this is, as I said, 1% acetic with a little bit of sodium acetate added. Now, this is the dyed matrix. And you'll actually be able to see that it's now bluish in color as opposed to being just a neutral blue-black. This has to be done for 1 minute. If I rinse it for longer or less, it changes the characteristics.
Okay.
And what I'm doing now is rinsing, and you can see it's pulling away the dye that was stuck to the surface.
Right.
But the matrix is still staying a lovely dark cyan color.
Right.
Because it's an acid, and this is acid-fixing dye, the dye isn't coming out of the gelatin, but it's rinsing off the excess, and the sodium acetate is pulling out just a bit more chemically. And the amount of time matters, because if I did it for longer than a minute, it would be even a stronger effect.
Okay, so this is not a completion process.
This is not a completion process, and it's one of the ways I can control the print is by varying the time if I need to.
Got it.
I'm letting the excess drain off right now. And then it's going into a holding bath here. This is just straight 1% acetic acid with nothing in it. And you see no more dye comes off at this point. It's being retained by the gelatin. And what we did here was we cleared off the excess. And we'll dump this because we don't need it now. It's just waste. Now we're ready to try and do a transfer. So, the paper is soaked in the conditioner now. And again, I'm just letting the excess run off for basically because it would be wasteful not to. This is my transfer easel. This is just a sheet of plate glass with a pin strip here, which you'll note is very similar to the pin strip that was on the vacuum easel.
Right.
It's the same kind of pins, the same spacing. This is how I maintain the registration.
Now, I can understand that that's going to register the film, but how does the paper stay in the same place?
Surface tension.
Again, a low-tech solution.
A low-tech solution. Some labs used granite slabs because the granite has a little bit of a tooth to it, and again, it's perfectly flat. And they complained about having problems with paper creep, in fact, between the different transfers. I have not had a problem with paper creep. And plate glass is a nice low-tech solution, and actually there's a chip in the corner because I banged it at one point, but if I ever break it, I can go down to the local glaziers and get another piece of plate glass. Here's where the transfer comes from. Okay. Take the matrix, and that little popping sound is me pressing the pins into the holes in the film.
Right.
I place the roller on the end of the film, hold the film tightly, and roll it down like this. And
One
now,
pass?
One pass. There's actually no advantage to multiple passes, and that can cause things to creep. I'm just wiping off a little of the excess acid from the edge. It doesn't really matter. It's just my way of working. And now we give it about 5 minutes to transfer. And during that time, the dye will transfer, hence the name of the process.
So is the dye being what, absorbed by the paper?
It's migrating out of the matrix because this is at a neutral pH. The paper's been soaked in a neutral conditioner. It's changing the acidity of the matrix. The matrix was in an acid bath before, and these are acid-fixing dyes, so it held on to the dye. Now the matrix is being brought back to a neutral pH, and the dye is free to migrate out. And it migrates down, goes into the emulsion of the paper, where the mordant molecules in the paper grab onto it and lock it up, so it can't migrate back. And this is a to-completion process.
Okay, about 5 minutes,
It takes about 5 minutes, but it doesn't matter as long as you let it go long enough.
Mm-hmm.
While the cyan matrix is transferring, I'm going to prepare the magenta printer. The magenta printer, I also know from having done test prints, is not only too dark, but in fact I do have a bit of highlight stain in it. That isn't necessarily anything that was done wrong in the processing. It could have just been the light in the original scene. Whatever, if I simply make a normal print, the birch bark doesn't come out exactly the white color I want, but everything else looks pretty good. So in this rinse, I'm not only adding some sodium acetate to take out some of the magenta and make it greener overall, but I'm adding a bit of the highlight reducer to take even a little more out of the highlights without affecting the rest of the color. That's the level of control I can get here.
Remarkable.
Being able to do this for all three colors individually is one of the reasons why dye transfers look so great. As we talked about, it's to create a reverse neologism. It's like having Photoshop in the darkroom.
Right.
It's also why it's been so terribly hard for people to master. It isn't just the time, it's the aesthetic and cognitive skills to look at all of these controls and not get completely lost by the complexity of what you're doing. And the best part about it is you don't actually have to do it in the darkroom.
Yeah. Well.
Now imagine what it'd be like, if you had to make prints through this kind of an arduous process and all had to be done in the dark or under dim safe light. You'd go mad. You really would. Okay, now I'm preparing the magenta matrix, same as we did the cyan. And you can see also, yes, it's a different color. It is the magenta. Well, we finished up the first transfer, so I'm going to peel back the matrix and see how it looks. Just slip my finger under one corner and voila! We have cyan.
Gee, that was easy.
Yeah, that part is easy. And the matrix is now pretty much free of dye. What I'll do is I'm going to put it in a hot water bath to rinse off the last little vestiges of dye and chemicals. And then if I'm going to make more prints, it goes back in the dye bath. Otherwise,
okay.
It gets hung up to dry again.
You
and
just dry, you file it, and you use it again at a future date.
Yeah, I can dry it and save it for future. And these are actually, in one sense, they're archival. The image isn't going to fade or deteriorate. They are also physical gelatin. Mold and mildew could attack them, insects could eat them. But because it's a physical relief image, we don't have to worry about the colors fading or the silver sulfiding out. So the matrices are actually a permanent record. Okay, now we go to the second color, which in this case is the magenta. And the order doesn't really matter. It's for convenience. It's easy to see what's happening this way. So we get the pins, and we get them in register. Again, I'm being careful to hold it up so it doesn't flop against the paper until I'm ready to roll it down. Set it, and we roll it. And now we wait again. As you can see, the physical making of a print isn't as long a process as a lot of people think. In less than half an hour, I have a print. If I had to rush things, 15 minutes. It's not much longer than, say, the ilfochrome process.
Right.
But the prep work is considerably longer. The preparation time is massively longer. The materials are much more expensive. The level of skill required is immensely higher. And frankly, when these prints are done, they're going to need a fair amount of spotting and retouching to look pristine, because there'll be little bits of dye specks that transferred that you didn't want to. There may be little scratches and bits of dirt that have attached to the matrix that'll have to be filled in. I'm really happy if I can turn out one finished dye transfer that I could sell to somebody in a day.
So this really goes a long way to explaining why these prints are so expensive.
Yes. And we're going on to the last one now, which is going to be the yellow. And just for the purpose of commentary, in the yellow printer here, I found there was nothing wrong with the overall density, but the highlights definitely had a yellowish tinge to them. Mm-hmm. As I said, there was probably the color cast of the light in the forest, but the birch bark, I really didn't want to have a color tinge. So I'm using a lot of highlight reducer here, actually a very large amount, which will tend to whiten up the highlights, but have very little effect on the reds and the greens. So we get that over and we rinse. And the reason this doesn't actually look yellow is because of all the blue-black pigment that was in the emulsion. So instead of sort of as a strange greenish color. But that's the emulsion we're primarily seeing as opposed to the yellow dye.
Now, the dyes that are left behind here in the trays, these are reusable, correct?
Yes. I use the concentrated dye to replenish them as they get depleted. It doesn't take much. Works out to about 2 milliliters of concentrate for a print this size. And I have large amounts of dye. I've got no likelihood of running out of dye. What I'm actually likely to be ultimately limited by is the availability of paper. The matrix film limits how many new photographs I can print as dye transfers. But I can make numerous prints from a set of matrices, so the total number of prints I make in my life by dye transfer will probably be limited by my paper supplies.
And how much paper do you have left?
Oh, over 1,000 sheets of paper, maybe 1,500.
So that's going to keep you busy for a number of years.
It will, it will. On the other hand, when you consider that I probably use an average of 3 sheets of paper to get the first good print before
okay. There's a factor.
Yes, there's a factor. I have had some sets of matrices that I made so perfectly that the first print I pulled from them was gorgeous. That's probably happened, easily a half dozen times in my entire career.
That many?
Yeah, that many. And consider that I've made well over 400 dye transfers in my life. Usually they'll require a modest amount of correction, and just because I can control it that well, I usually do. So more often the second print's good, but typically the third print is the right one. On the other hand, I've had some that just plain were cranky and needed a lot of work to be the way I want, and I've sometimes had perfectly good sets of matrices where it wasn't until the 8th or the 9th print that it came out exactly the way I wanted it to. And it wasn't a matter of going back and remaking the matrices, it was a matter of making all those subtle adjustments so that it clicked. It just looked right.
Right, and those are the adjustments that you make with the
dyes, with the rinses,
chemicals.
with the acidity of the dyes, all of that. Okay, well this should be done now, and yes, this is what we get with both the cyan and the magenta. It's a print absent the yellow. But it's starting to look kind of like a photograph now. Now we go to the last color, the yellow. There is actually a practical reason why I print the yellow last. It's because the more I work with the paper, the more likely a bit of dust or dirt or something will settle on it from the air and make a speck that has to be retouched out. Can't see any flaws in the yellow. So if most of the flaws, if there are any, happen in the yellow layer, it means there really isn't any serious retouching to be done. Whereas if it happened in something like the magenta, you would clearly see those little specks of green. And this is what the rinse water looks like afterwards. You can see there's a very, very little bit of color in there. Almost every bit of dye that was in the matrix got transferred into the print. Although we didn't get into it, there's nothing to keep me from doing second and third transfers with the same matrix of the same color used in different ways. For instance, if I decided I needed a little more color in the highlights and didn't want to affect the rest, I could take these matrices after I had washed them and not re-dye them, but just treat them with some rinse that I'd put a little dye in. Take the rinse and say put just a little magenta into it, to tint it a little magenta. And when I would rinse the matrix with that, it would pick up a little magenta from that. The most complex print I've ever done is the photograph that's on the cover of the first edition of Post Exposure and on my website, the one of the total eclipse of the sun with that beautiful pearly corona. That takes 8 transfers to do. It's horrendous. It's a horrible print to make. It is excruciating because to get all the tonality over the whole range requires 2 different sets of matrices, one for the shadows and one for the highlights. It's actually a 6 matrix process, and some of them I have to use twice to lend just the right amount of color. It's insane. It's a gorgeous print, but I'll never do something that difficult again in my life if I can help it. I mention it only because it's an example of just how far one can take this. And a lot of the times I do actually have to go to a second transfer, say for the highlights like I talked about, just to kick them up a little.
Right.
Little subtle effects. And it's a way to print in a little bit more highlight detail without affecting anything else. By doing this dye with the rinse technique I mentioned, it only puts in a very small amount of dye, so it most strongly affects highlights. So for instance, you can sort of double the density in the highlights without affecting anything else. The transfer should be completed now. So my fingernail under the edge, and let's see what we got. Oh yes.
By George, it's a color print.
It's a full color print.
That's wonderful. Absolutely great.
This is a print we were making under demonstration conditions, and it's not exactly right by my standards. I would go back and tweak it a bit more, but it's very, very close.
Yeah,
it's extremely close.
I'm not sure that I'm satisfied with the color in the highlights.
No, we've still got a bit too much yellow in the highlights, as you can see. And it turns out I took out a bit too much magenta. There's just a little bit greenish in the highlights. But that's something I could fix in the rinses. In fact, overall, I think the print is a little bit too greenish, because overall the color looks excellent here, which means it will dry a bit green. So when I print it next time, I'll use a little less of the chemicals that pull dye out of the magenta printer. Not much, 0.5% less, and that'll be dead on. I know that close enough.
Right.
And I'll still probably keep this one as a second anyway, because sometimes you need a demo print.
Right. So now, last step other than cleanup is how do you dry it?
Wipe off the excess moisture. And it just goes on to a wireframe drying rack, like you would with any normal fiber-based print.
Right. Ctein, this has been terrific. I want to thank you very much. I've enjoyed this immensely. There are a lot of steps. There's a lot of magic as well as science involved in this. And I think, speaking on behalf of everybody, this is really a wonderful experience to watch the last of the great dye transfer printers at work. Thank you.
Well, I was glad to help and show
I
it off.
appreciate it.
Yes.